Schuffner on the lead guitar, everybody. Got tired of the skyline and that Commonwealth way. No more of the campfire and that constant wait. No, I got me a plane ride to that golden state. Gonna leave it all behind, the life that I've made. If you want out wheels that got too rough, go on, make your mind up and just change. I must admit that it backfired, or was already too late. It felt more like a landslide than a great escape. I got caught up in the wildfires and my own damn flames, and now I'm left with a long drive and myself to blame. If you want out wheels that got too rough, go on, make your mind up and just change. If you want out wheels that got too rough, go on, make your mind up and just change. If you want out wheels that got too rough, go on, make your mind up and just. Don't say that I'm a liar. Don't say that I'm a I will give you my desire. With all that is required.
Because they'll be putting that
Made a lot of the short drive. Our conversations don't end right. I guess it's because we're on such separate sides. And I appreciate the ride, but we're never gonna make it there on time. If you're driving 55, 'cause if this train's gonna go my way, I gotta beat it. I can't stay here lost and lonely, waiting on the next one to come around. There are days that I feel weak. There are nights that I can't sleep. Oh, I'm so anxious, waiting on the next thing that's going down. Oh, I'm going down. We made short work of this long drive. I'm feeling more dead than alive. I look like hell, and I've never been so damn tired. I got tired of the straight line. Maybe this time in exile will help me define and make sense of my own mind. 'Cause if this train's gonna go my way, I gotta beat it. I can't stay here lost and lonely, waiting on the next one to come around. There are days that I feel weak. There are nights that I can't sleep. Oh, I'm so anxious, waiting on the next thing that's going down. Oh, I'm going down. It's way Sunday without you around. I'm good as gone. And if this day's gonna go my way, I gotta greet it. I can't stay here lost and lonely, waiting on the next one to come around. I got a train, I can't be weak. Pay my bills and get some sleep. God, I'm so anxious, waiting on the next thing that's going down. If this train's gonna go my way, I gotta beat it. I can't stay here lost and lonely, waiting on the next one to come around.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Science on Tap Cincinnati. Thanks for coming out this evening. First off, thank yous. Thanks to Urban Artifact, as always, for being such nice partners. And a special shout out to Radio Artifact, Devin and Andrew. If you have friends who weren't able to make it here tonight, our presentations are streamed live and are recorded, and you can find all the presentations at the Radio Artifact channel, both on YouTube and Twitch. So tonight's speaker, in the various and sundry years that I've been working with Science on Tap, I've always been trying to find different topics, different areas of science, et cetera, always in the goal of trying to not only promote the science that goes on in our region, but also to promote the scientists that do all this research. And as time goes on, I go down different paths and I uncover different and unusual nuggets. And so a few months back, one of those nuggets that I stumbled on was the UC philosophy department. And I'm going like, philosophy, what does that have to do with science? And here I find out that the philosophy of science is something that is not only an important topic, but it's something that a number of folks in the philosophy department at UC are engaged in. So it just shows, again, the breadth and depth of the scientific investigation that goes on in our region, which we're really fortunate to have. So tonight's speaker is Angela Potochnik. She is a professor of philosophy at University of Cincinnati, and she's also the director of science engagement with public engagement with science. And so her focus is on what science is and how science works, what are the mechanisms of science. So with that, please welcome Angela and to her presentation.
Thank you, Bob, and thanks to you and the other organizers for inviting me, and thanks to everyone for showing up. I'm excited to be here to try to make philosophy of science, or at least some bits of what we work on, hopefully seem at least a little bit interesting. That's my goal. So as Bob said, I'm a professor in the philosophy department here at the University of Cincinnati. I work in philosophy of science. I'm not going to be talking a lot about my main research, which is around scientific explanation and related issues broadly across science. So much tonight as the relationship between science and the public is the direction that I'm going in this talk. All right, so let's start here. Do you recognize these people? Who are these people? None of these questions are rhetorical. Bill Nye, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Richard Feynman. The last guy is probably least well known, and he's the most cantankerous of them, by far, grouchiest, annoying. Lawrence Krauss. Okay, so what do they have in common? Men, yes. It's worth noting. What else? Receding hairlines, okay. They're scientists or popularizers of science, all of those things. There's another one. There's a secret one that only the other people in this room, which there are a couple of who have PhDs in philosophy of science, might recognize. They all are on record hating philosophy of science. They think it's worthless. They think there's nothing there. Let's move on. So this was back in 2012, and it focused on a debate that Lawrence Krauss was at the center of, a piece on NPR focusing on why it is that these physicists and scientists and science popularizers are so anti-philosophy, why it seems so useless to them. More recently than this, I didn't end up featuring this in the presentation, but Lawrence Krauss had a super grouchy op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about how the humanities are ruining good science. And so I'm very proud. I have a response as an op-ed in Scientific American, talking about how, in fact, we need humanities, we need philosophers in order to have a rich picture of the ways in which science has been shaped by society, and to help out in the project of figuring out how science can contribute to society. All right, so that's my pitch. I figure if you're a philosopher of science talking to a generalist audience, it doesn't hurt to try to sort of say something about what you do and defensively say that it's actually worth doing. So obviously, as I think I've already suggested, all four of these are wrong in being critical of philosophy of science, and it's worth noting that Nye is also on record changing his view. He's been convinced by someone that he knows personally that philosophy of science has something going for it after all.
Do they have PhDs?
Did they have PhDs? I assume so, but that's actually a good question. I'm not good with specific facts. Okay, so we have a fact checker who says, yes, we think so. All right, so let's talk about what philosophy of science is. I said, broadly that they're wrong and that it is valuable. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth here. I'm just going to make a really basic point about what we do with our time during the days. Scientists do science, right? We all know this. They're focused on phenomena in the natural world or the social world. This is a really cartoon and cartoonish image of the scientific method, which is, of course, not a single method, but it's a broad grouping of sort of practices that scientists tend to engage in. So this is overly simplistic. But something like this is what scientists are by and large up to, right? They try to generate understanding of our world that we can then use, we broadly and also narrowly, right, scientists and also society in general, knowledge that we can use to guide our projects and satisfy our curiosity. They're doing science. Philosophers of science, in contrast, spend our time looking at the human endeavor of science, right? So we're not busying ourselves in the lab or in the field or in front of a computer making models. We're not doing the science. So we have the time, the opportunity, and the skill set to take a step back and look at what the practices that comprise science are and how those relate to human projects more generally. We focus on how science unfolds, its hidden assumptions, right, identifying maybe where it's gone wrong and has some mistaken assumptions behind some project or another, science's tools and methods, its range of findings and how they relate to one another, and its relationship to society. So this is essential work for making sense of science and for conducting the best science that we as a society can. That our science popularizers don't understand this is actually a huge missed opportunity, right? This is part of the project of making sense of science broadly to people who are interested in science. All right, so that's my deal. This is where I'm coming from. That's the framework for my approach today. I'm going to talk about three things, broadly speaking, in the rest of the time. First, I want to start by engaging in an investigation with you on the question of what scientific literacy is, what we mean when we say we want to be able to sort of make sure that people broadly understand science. What actually is that? I think it's much more complicated than a lot of times even the folks invested in that happening notice. And then I want to talk a little bit, move from there to talk a little bit about not understanding of science, but zooming out to think about public trust in science and how that might be relevant to this interface between science and the public. And then finally, right at the end, Bob mentioned in his introduction that I founded and direct the Center for Public Engagement with Science at the University of Cincinnati. And I'll close by telling you just a tiny bit about what we're up to, because I think it fits well with the themes of what I'll be talking about tonight. Okay, so getting started. This is hopelessly tiny font. I'm sorry, it's a copy and paste. It's not my font. You don't have to read it. It's not important. I will say anything that you need to know from it. What this is, though, is the U.S.'s National Science Foundation's survey for Americans' knowledge of scientific facts. They've used this same survey for decades, which is a good thing, right? Because then we can track percentages of correct answers over time, trends in those responses, and relate them to other societal changes, et cetera. So they've been very conservative in not updating the survey. The survey includes primarily, and this is what I copied and pasted onto the slide here, true-false questions about factual knowledge. So these include, I'm close enough I can read it, questions like the center of the Earth is very hot. Does the Earth go around the sun, or does the sun go around the Earth? Electrons are smaller than atoms. The universe began with a huge explosion. All right, so questions like this, mainly true-false. I don't know what they do about the Earth around the sun question. That doesn't seem true-false. Anyway, so mainly just true-false, sort of these simple facts about science. They also at the end have a handful. This is the full list of the factual questions, and they have a handful, really just 2 or 3 questions about probability and experimental design. And then they have 1 or a couple of questions about whether some pursuit qualifies as scientific. So often this is astrology. Is astrology a science? And that's the survey. That's sort of what we use to gauge Americans' views of science, Americans' knowledge of scientific facts, and how those have changed over decades. Some problems. First of all, these questions, as we've seen with the examples that I gave, which is about half the questions, target simple recall knowledge. Their content doesn't reflect common science education standards. Why does that matter? The stuff that teachers emphasized to us all when we were students in science classrooms. There's no evidence that the questions actually are a representative sample of content knowledge. So that might mean that what you're showing when you say that only 46% of Americans say that it's true that electrons are smaller than atoms is something about their recall of what electron means and atom means versus like their overall scientific knowledge. That's the first problem. These are not my ideas. These are sort of demonstrated issues with the survey instrument that have been published over time. Another problem. This survey has been administered in a study to more than 500 scientists. Many of the scientists found the questions to be problematic, and especially the questions that related to the stuff they work on, right? So the stuff that's about electrons and atoms, if I'm a biologist, you're like, okay, fine, but like how you phrased this question about life on Earth, you could have done better there. And when the scientists took the survey, many of them couldn't get the answers right themselves. Something's gone wrong, right? We're not asking the right questions if that's the case when scientists are taking the survey. I at least hope that scientists count as scientifically literate, whatever we consider that to be. And then finally, this is a really interesting one. There are a couple of hot button questions. So especially, I mentioned one of them, the universe began with a huge explosion. So this is about the Big Bang, which tends to be a pretty divisive topic because it's about the start of the entire universe. And human beings, as we know them today, developed from earlier species of animals. So hot button questions in the sense of these are sort of socially divisive, right? Depending on other facts about who you are as a person, your cultural and social allegiances, and what those relate to, right? Religious belief, primarily. These could be sort of, these could introduce confounding variables into how you answer these questions. And in fact, nice research has shown that it does. If you administer the same survey and you sub in elephants instead of human beings, elephants, as we know them today, developed from earlier species of animals, then the number of respondents answering correctly goes from 49% up to 68%, right? Just because you've distanced yourself from that sort of cultural hot button, like, oh, I have to respond in a way that's consistent with my self-identity here, element to the question. You notice it's, like, the theoretical content is the same there. It's just not priming you in the same way. And then with the Big Bang question, what this study on the survey did is add according to astronomers at the beginning. So instead of asking whether the universe began with a huge explosion, the question is it true that according to astronomers, the universe began with a Big Bang or with a huge explosion? Correct responses go from 38% to 65%, right? So again, a huge boost forward. All right, these are those two questions. So what I think this does is it brings into focus the question of what the specific target should be for scientific literacy, right? Is it that we need to like have drilled into us that the reason we're dealing with climate change is CO2, right? That's one of at least the main gases. That electrons are smaller than than atoms, right? That by golly, if we're smart Americans, we have to know that the Earth goes around the sun. Is that what's at heart of this, right? The content of scientific knowledge. The question is, what should members of the public understand about science? And equating this with content knowledge, I've tried to suggest anyway, seems like it's too quick, right? There has to be a reason to give for why that's what's important to understand about science, if that's the answer. There's some more influential research in the last decade. I'm thinking here particularly of some work by a guy named Feinstein, I don't remember his first name, who suggests that standard views of scientific literacy aim to produce what he calls marginal insiders, right? People who think about science like scientists and are kind of like scientists to some extent, right? They didn't get all the way down the path if they aren't in a career as a practicing scientist, but they're some way down that path. And the better scientific literacy is, the further down the path they are. So instead of this, Feinstein suggests that instead the goal should be to produce competent outsiders. And so what he means by this is that what we generally, those of us who aren't practicing scientists, need to get about science, need to understand, is actually sort of how to effectively use scientific expertise in situation-specific ways. So when I need to know what our best science has to say about some medical issue maybe that a doctor is discussing with me, I know where to turn and I know how to do that. And this is in contrast to the idea of cultivating this just sort of broad-ranging scientific expertise where if you ask me about electrons, I'll tell you, their relative size until you get bored and walk away. Okay, so the idea here is shifting the target for scientific literacy, what we're after, from content knowledge of science toward things like identifying when science is relevant to one's goals, identifying how to seek scientific expertise that furthers your goals, and then figuring out why, when, and about what to trust scientists. Okay, so I think that this sort of suggestion that we shift what the target is for scientific literacy also brings into focus this question of why, right? So the question of what we should do, what we should be aiming for with scientific literacy has lurking behind us the question of, well, what matters, right? Why do we want everybody broadly to be scientifically literate? What seems important about that? And there's one kind of, unexamined view that can lurk in the background of the work of really smart people doing really good work in science education and other related fields. That's just a kind of, and I think those of us who care about science, and if you're in this room, probably you do, probably I think have something like this kind of in the background of how we think about the relationship that the broad public has to science. It's important, right? Science is really important. So you should know about it, right? It's better. It's good for you. It's just good. And there's this kind of sense that it's going to help your life, right? It's going to be good if you just know more science. So some folks have questioned, right, whether that's enough, whether we can just stop there and say, well, it's just a good thing, right? It feels important to me and I find it really interesting, so you should know about it too. And move instead, and this is associated with this move to thinking about different potential targets for scientific literacy. We might think also along these same lines that the goals of scientific literacy might especially be these down here. So that is the goal of increasing the ability of groups or of individuals to make evidence-based decisions, right? That's pretty clearly suggested by the lower quadrant of targets for what scientific literacy might be that I circled, right? How to seek scientific expertise, how to tell when scientific expertise is needed. Sorry, drink break. As well as improving the ability of an individual or group to know which scientific claims to believe and how to apply those claims. That one, I think, is pretty approachable as an important one. This does seem to be part of what feels like is at stake in talking to folks who might love science a little bit less than you do about science, right? You need to know what to believe, and you need to know when science is the place to look for those answers. Okay. Knowing that science is helpful, we might think, Knowing science is helpful, we might think, when it generates practical ability to put scientific knowledge to use. And this recalls also, which I maybe should have emphasized a bit more, this sort of context specificity of figuring out when science matters, not in general, but to my life, something like that. All right, so, up here in this quadrant that I kind of dismissed pretty quickly was, and I didn't discuss at all, was a potential target for scientific literacy of scientific methods and their rationale. I don't think this is irrelevant. I think probably focusing on scientific methods and broad understanding of scientific methods is probably more important than broad content knowledge in science. And the reason is that it can plug in this knowledge of scientific methods, and the whys behind the methods especially can plug in some of these same places. Knowledge of scientific methods and why those methods exist can be really important for identifying scientific expertise, identifying the nature of the expertise, right, and why it's there in a way that can't be mimicked by sort of just flashy presentation of other ideas, because they haven't mimicked the process, right? The social structure of science and the careful study of our world that has slowly generated true knowledge. So the goal here, notice, is not to turn people into mini scientists if they're not scientists, right? To make it so that I can run home and do a random controlled blind study in my house. It's for me to, as an outsider, be able to understand what scientists are doing when that happens, so that I know to ask, well, was the study controlled, right? Was group assignment blind? Things like that, so that I can assess whether a given finding is something that's worthy of my trust or not. Okay, so for example, so the picture here and why I'm invested in thinking that it matters what the public knows about scientific methods is that this is an approach that I take in an introductory undergraduate textbook that I've co-authored that you see the cover of here, as well as in a course that uses this book in the philosophy department at UC, which is a general education course that students can take for natural sciences and quantitative reasoning credit. So it's not a humanities credit, right? You're actually getting sort of a general education credit in quantitative reasoning and natural sciences for taking this course that puts first and sort of foremost in front of students what the methods and reasoning patterns are in science, and hopefully sets those students up, students who by and large won't go on in science, to be able to reason in a more sophisticated way about the usefulness of science, when it's useful, and how to put it into action. I've thought about my students, this is silly, but on a regular basis during COVID, as you know, anyway, with COVID testing, I'm like, please remember false negatives, false positives. Like, a test result does not mean you have it or don't. You need to have one step beyond that. It's one small respect in which it's come to mind for me over this last few years. So here's another simple example. Non-scientists may not need to know how to use statistics to test a hypothesis, right? We talk about this in the class that we use this book for, but we don't try to make it so that students are able to put together what a statistical test would look like of some hypothesis. Instead, we the non-scientist public, benefit from knowing about how statistical hypothesis testing extends the reach of the conclusions that scientists can draw, right? So it doesn't seem like sort of spooky magic, right? There actually is an evidential warrant there. And then also about how variation, right? The very reason that we need statistical hypothesis testing means that I can't draw firm conclusions about the world based only on salient examples that I happen to know about. Like, you know, the famous grandpa who smoked like a chimney but lived to 100, right? There's a reason why we can't just go on our sort of own firsthand experience in cases like that. All right, so that's a simple example that relates to some of the content of this. And I wanted to sort of pause just to talk about the special role that it seems like discussion of scientific methods might play when we think about what we who are not practicing scientists might need to know about science. All right, so let's return now to the last item that was on the list that I put in front of you before of possible goals for scientific literacy. That is, identifying why, when, and about what to trust scientists. This seems really important. It seems especially important now when it seems like, not only seems like, there's research showing that science is increasingly politically polarized. We need sort of broad societal buy-in for certain things like belief in the safety or worthwhileness of vaccines, certainly the need for societal action on climate change, right? It matters what people think about these issues. Science denial is a name that's used for the phenomenon of rejecting scientific findings that, at least according to the norms of science, should be accepted. So notable examples, I've already mentioned the two biggest of these, but evolution, as we've talked about earlier, especially of humans, the Big Bang again, the safety of vaccinations, and of course, probably most importantly, climate change. So notice that, so science denial, right, is denying what appears to be scientific knowledge about these things. A step beyond science denial, which is familiar, I bet, to all of us, is taking my distrust or disinclination to accept particular scientific findings, like about climate change or about human evolution, and using that to, in turn, inspire deep distrust in the very enterprise of science, right? So moving from, I can't trust this claim that I find it impossible to accept, to the whole game is a joke, right? I can't trust science at all. And that latter step seems pretty related to the sort of increased political polarization that we see of science. Okay, so there is, it seems, as I just suggested, a political valence in how science denial occurs. It's not that it just happens by people, happens in people with politically conservative views, but there is a political valence in how it plays out and in the reactions to it. And this has led, I think, sort of on both sides, sort of been an engine driving the increasing political polarization of science itself, at least in the US. That is, there's increasingly an association of science with the political left and an association of opposition to science with the political right. So I think of these, one things that come to mind here, I'm not criticizing at all, but one thing that comes to mind here are these yard signs, right, that have at some point been pretty ubiquitous. What's notable in this context about this is a series of issues that, at least by implication, are politicized issues in the US right now, and science is real is one of those, right? So this is, again, not to criticize it, just to note that me posting a yard sign like this is feeding into that political polarization of science sort of circumstance where we find ourselves. So yeah, using this simply as an illustration of how at this moment in time, the very enterprise of science, at least how it's caricatured in popular discourse, often is seen as politically polarized. Okay, so a philosopher and historian of science, Maya Goldenberg, has recently, in a great book of hers on vaccine hesitancy that she wrote just prior to COVID-19, talk about accidental timeliness of research, she's encouraged a shift in framing from seeing the science denial and political polarization of science that we find ourselves with, shifting it from thinking about this as a war on expertise, right? Sort of these outsiders don't accept the proper authority of science. We need to get them to. And instead, shifting this in some ways on its head and framing it instead as a crisis of trust in science and medicine. So that doesn't mean that people, that it's unimportant or that people have equally good views when they reject scientific knowledge than folks who accept scientific knowledge on some finding. But it draws attention away from criticizing individuals, right? Thinking especially about individual people who deny scientific expertise or the conclusions that those individuals support. Individuals who deny scientific expertise or deny the conclusions supported by scientific expertise, like climate change and the safety of vaccinations. And it draws our attention toward working to develop trust in science and medicine through means like patient-doctor relationships, these sort of really on-the-ground human connections that we all still have, regardless of political polarization and level of scientific literacy. Okay, so my little picture with crisis of trust is a fake news picture, right? It's supposed to indicate fake news there. Misinformation on social media certainly isn't helping anything. It's not as if this is a constant in the background, right? This is a new, really tremendously difficult problem facing science communication and public communication more broadly. But notice also, and this is still drawing from Goldenberg's work, that if people had better access to scientific expertise and, pointing back to the top of my slide, a better understanding of why, when, and about what science actually is trustworthy, then they would have tools to avoid being, or to the extent that that's true, they would have tools to avoid being quite as easy of a target for misinformation campaigns on social media than they might otherwise be. So it really is, I think, at least in large part, I'm making a point of where we focus attention. We can focus on all of the ways in which scientific authority is being assaulted from the outside. And a lot of times, there are big, scary actors involved. Fossil fuel industry, cigarette companies, right, back in the day, disputing the science that smoking causes cancer, etc. And maybe, we can focus on why some individual who doesn't have the social and cultural connections such that they show up to an event about science on tap, or of science on tap, can be in a better situation to figure out for themselves why they should care about science, when it might be useful, and when and about what they can trust scientists or scientific consensus. And implicit in that last idea, right, is the answer is not everything. Science does everything. It doesn't. It does certain jobs very well. And that's when we can actually turn to science, and should. Okay, so I'll close by talking just a bit about the Center for Public Engagement with Science at the University of Cincinnati, which, as I mentioned at the outset, I started 5 years ago and have been working with a bunch of folks at UC to develop out since then, a couple of whom are in the room. Okay, so this is now a dated, the photos on this picture are dated. We have more faculty affiliates than this at this point, but this is some of our faculty affiliates at the Center for Public Engagement with Science, or PEWS, which is what we've adopted as our short form name for it. And then along the bottom are the logos of some of our partner organizations here in Cincinnati. As I said, this group's expanded more since I first put together this particular slide. The aim of PEWS is to work in an interdisciplinary and community-partnered way to improve the interface between science, especially at UC, and the public, especially but not only in Greater Cincinnati. So that's super broad, which makes it kind of impossible to implement. But we're slowly figuring out what that actually means and what we're in a good position to be able to do related to it. So it doesn't just mean holding events to tell people about UC scientific research, although that's tons of fun. I do like that part. But rather, it's also things like trying to support UC scientific research actually becoming more responsive to local needs, and thus being more worthy of public trust, right? If scientific research is actually addressing local community needs, then it's easier to see why you should care about that science. And also providing resources for researchers and for students to become more skilled in public engagement in all of its form, right? Which can mean talking to an audience about something, it can mean public writing, can mean going into K through 12 classrooms, yes, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so I hope these quick statements that I have on this slide, right, that there's a need for an improved relationship between science and the public, including scientific literacy, trust in scientific institutions, and support from academic science for science-informed policies and practices. And the idea that that need can be met by public engagement with science, understood as cutting-edge interdisciplinary approaches to address complex issues, not just about what we know through science, right, but about things like trust in science, warranted distrust in particular science, political polarization of science, how science relates to identities and worldviews, scientific methods, and science's role in society. I hope that these statements of how we are trying to work to address it in PEWS and of what we see the need as being all hit some of the same notes that I've been talking about during this talk. And then at the bottom of the slide, here's just a handful of our many activities that we have been developing out involving public engagement with science, as well as research and teaching on what public engagement with science involves. And I will stop there. Thank you for having me, and I'm really eager to hear your thoughts and questions from here. Yes.
So I was curious, and I enjoyed your talk. Thank you so much. But I noticed that you didn't use a couple of words that I think kind of filter into that, which is like the critical thinking that goes behind the scientific method, and identifying what is worthy of trust and not, but also kind of the bias that plays into that, like identifying those fallacies. So I was, that we might see, or at least should be aware of the possibility of those. And I was just wondering if that's just language that doesn't necessarily fit with what you're trying to.
Good. Yeah, so the question is, I was told I should repeat the questions. The question is whether it's consistent with what I'm saying to think that there should also be an emphasis on critical thinking and the identification of biases and thought that people might be subject to as part of this broader strategy for educating folks, including undergraduates, about sort of how to be sophisticated appliers of scientific knowledge. Do I have it right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, with the whole identifying the, I think, critical thinking aspect of, the scientific method, and also kind of establishing those questions. But I was just thinking that a lot of what you were talking about seems like establishing, critical thinking and going, okay, that doesn't seem quite right, and being able to apply that. I just, like I said, because they're kind of, I don't want to mean buzzwords per se, but, you didn't really use that language, and I didn't know if you were kind of trying to get away from
If that was intentional or not.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think critical thinking and sort of a sense for ways in which humans are flawed reasoners are both very important aspects of this as well. So yes, so wasn't intentionally avoiding that framing at all. An add-on thought is that one thing I haven't taken the time to actually talk about tonight is why scientific methods are so powerful, right? When you add up the ways in which scientists use evidence to assemble arguments and use the social structure of science to kind of see what passes muster overall when you consult multiple perspectives. That really briefly described their series of practices makes science not flawless, but an incredibly powerful tool that really isn't duplicated, right? Professionalized science isn't duplicated anywhere. So I think the sort of deeper appreciation for scientific methods and the whys behind them hopefully will bring into greater relief how the warrant behind scientific knowledge kind of can't be matched elsewhere. And one of the ways actually in the Recipes for Science textbook that I showed you the cover of, we set up that project in large part by saying, look, all of us are limited and flawed reasoners. And in fact, right, so confirmation bias is my favorite example. The more education you get, the worse you are at confirmation bias, right? So it's not that we get more educated and then we think better. In certain respects, we have the same flaws in reasoning, and we just get better at engaging in that sort of flawed motivated reasoning. But there are these special tricks that the institution of science has over time happened upon and developed, cultivated, that can control all of the weaknesses, when done very well, of individual reasoners in this way that, like I said, is sort of has unprecedented power. Thanks. Yeah.
I want to piggyback off that a little bit. You mentioned undergraduates. I am curious, I feel like you need to start that education on critical thinking well before you become an undergraduate, back in primary school. And I'm wondering in your research, have you seen that primary education is it going more towards teaching critical thinking? I'm thinking of like the recent, more recently, people may remember like the change in how they taught math, right? And people were like, why did they change how they teach
Right.
math? I said, well, because they're trying to teach them critical thinking as a tool. Why the math works that way, as opposed to just memorize your multiplication tables.
Yeah.
Is primary education kind of flying in the face of maybe what
Good.
we're worried about, or is it what your concerns are, what you're talking about, or is it kind of going the opposite direction and just teaching more basic skills and forget the critical thinking?
Good. So the question is, so the point was made, which is a good point, that we can't start inculcating scientific literacy doesn't start when we're undergraduates in college, that it has to start way earlier than that. And that's absolutely true. And so then the question is, how is K through 12 education doing in sort of cultivating this richer sense of scientific literacy? So I can't resist saying this is not my area of expertise.
Sure.
I'm not expert in this. I know a bit about the next generation science standards, though, which is the current U.S. Curricular model for science education. It's not adopted uniformly across states. Every state got to choose whether to adopt NGSS or not. But my understanding is even states that didn't have a very closely related curriculum at this point, it's just adapted in certain respects, probably relate to some of these issues that we're talking about today, around sort of hot button topics. At any rate, at least as the next generation science standards are theorized, are thought of, they do emphasize scientific practices and sort of I can't remember the terminology for this bit, but the methods whereby scientists come to know. Again, I'm not an expert. There could be a really good explanation for this. I did, when my older daughter was in kindergarten, I looked up the science standards and the implementation for kindergarten, and they sounded really great and ambitious, and then it was like a big spreadsheet, and then there were just a lot of columns that said like TBD, which raised a little bit of concerns for me, but it does seem like the NGSS sort of framework, at least, is robust and moving in this direction. My guess is that the details really vary across districts and schools. Yes?
Quick question. Do you have like a social media presence, like with the organization?
Yes, we do. I totally failed. There should have been a call to action at the end where I tell you how to find us. So what are we? So we're at Engaging Science on Twitter. Is that right, Jonathan? Okay. So our website should be pretty easy to find, and it has all the rest. So if you just Google UC Center for Public Engagement with Science, or the website is ucengagingscience.org.
At UC Engage Science on Twitter.
At UC Engage Science on Twitter. We're also on Facebook. We're kind of on Instagram, but I'm too old to understand Instagram, so mostly we don't do much on there.
If you do need any help with your Instagram presence, that's kind of what I do for work. I'm
Okay.
happy to talk
All
to
right.
you
We should talk about it. Sounds good. Thank you.
Amazing.
And then was there a question back here? Yeah.
Yeah, you spoke about the class you teach for undergraduates who are not scientists or engineers. Do you think that there's more need for that for people who are scientists and engineers? Because I'm an engineer and we never had any kind of classes or discussion about that.
Yes.
I find that when people are outside of their area of expertise, they turn to everybody else. They're just as stupid as everybody else.
Yeah, okay, so I always forget that I need to repeat the question, so I'll do my best. So the question is, this class that you're talking about, which by the way is called How Science Works, uses the Recipes for Science textbook. I've talked about it for students who won't go on in science or engineering, but the question is, wouldn't this be useful for STEM students as well? And then the point was made, which is I think a really important point that I haven't emphasized enough. It's not like scientists are these magical great creatures who have all of this figured out, right? Scientists, best I can tell, are just normal people like me and everyone, I think, in here as well. So we all have our sort of limitations in reasoning, and they can be, our limitations can make us pretty narrow as reasoners. I think it would be amazing if a class like this were more available to STEM undergraduates. Yes. We have Once or twice offered this as a first-year experience, which made it, for magical curricular reasons that I've forgotten, so that a bunch of STEM majors signed up right at the beginning of their college experience, and I think it was really good and they really liked the class. When I have, and I haven't done a lot in this regard, but when I have tried to kind of push in this direction, the quite common response, which makes a lot of sense, is for those majors, the course schedule is just packed. There's no room for anything. So it's an opportunity for those of us in a university setting who care about this kind of thing to try to find clever ways to make something like this a possible resource, even if there's not room to include it officially in a major curriculum. Yes?
So I think you talked about the primary issue is identified as a crisis of trust, and I just wonder if there's any research around what's causing that, and if it's changed over time. If there's like a scientific method applied to like just finding out what causes it.
Good. Yeah. So the question is there research into this crisis of trust in science? And is it a real thing? Is it a new crisis? Has it increased over time? What do we know about it? So there is that science, combination of, I think, social scientific research and community psychology, communication research maybe is what's coming to mind for me right now. I'm not fully on top of it right now. I think that there's enough for kind of arguments to run in both directions. So there are new issues like an information climate that's just saturated and a pretty flattened information climate, right, where you can get stuff on social media and in certain other places quite easily, right? Anybody can have a megaphone now. So that is one new influence that's often highlighted. On the other hand, by some metrics, there's actually still a whole lot of, and not decreasing, societal support for scientific enterprise, right? Funding in science, et cetera. There's no evidence, it seems, that when asked these broad questions about science, at least when phrased carefully, that societal support for science is eroding or anything like that. Yeah, that's, I think, as much as I can say right now, other than, yes, there is research on this. And like I said, there's kind of, it's a complex answer. Yes?
This is more on your personal views on the topic, but would you define science as specifically a tool or more of the general as an overarching umbrella topic?
Okay, so the question is, do I think of science more as a tool or as an overarching umbrella topic? I think it's really hard. We can talk about lots of different aspects of science, many of which are important to talk about. I think if put on the spot, as I am at the moment, I think I would want to really emphasize the scientific institution, right, or enterprise, as I've said a couple of times in this discussion. And what I mean by that is really trying to draw attention to the social organization of science, right? So the resources are made available by institutionalized science, the need to be accountable to one's peers, right? So one can't just come up with ideas, right? But such that it is rigorously vetted by other experts, and the ability of institutionalized science to make available different perspectives. That's really important as a way of generating the ideas and sort of full perspective, range of perspectives on topics, such that you can generate trustworthy results. So I really want to, like I said, to summarize, there's no single answer, but I really want to push hard on emphasizing the institutional aspects of science and what's made available by that. Yes?
Susan, so you talked about politicization of science, and you said there's evidence that this is definitely happening. Is there evidence that the stereotypical categories we throw people into are at all accurate?
And do you mean political categories?
Yeah. That this political category doesn't believe in science, and this political category does. Is there any evidence that any of that is actually true, or is it all just politicization?
Okay, so the question is there evidence that that the sort of view of science as politically polarized, right? That right, political conservatives in the U.S. are science deniers, and political liberals, carry the mantle of science. Is that at all accurate? So things kind of cut both directions on this question as well. So there is an increased political polarization of science right now, in the sense, I hope I'm recalling the details correctly, but especially if subjects are primed by having to recall their political identity, they tend to answer questions about science differently depending on their political parties. On the other hand, I said briefly in passing, it can be really easy to sort of slide into a lazy, political conservatives in the U.S. deny science view. And there is sort of equal opportunity questioning of particular scientific claims that don't fit well with other social identities for people of all political backgrounds.
What are the answers if they're not primed with identifying? In
Um,
other words, double blind the thing. would you get the same? What results would you get if you double blind asked the same questions? And
Yeah,
didn't
so-
know what category they.
So the follow-up question is whether sort of the political party difference in views on science persists, even if we're not primed by thinking about our political identities. And this is the easiest answer. I don't know.
Can also be the correct answer.
Yes. Sorry, right here.
First of all, I really appreciate that UC has a public engagement for science department. That's really cool. But I'm going to present maybe a devil's advocate perspective. It's easy for me to think that science is coded blue, and that maybe this is an extension of institutional distrust.
Mm-hmm.
So, I was just wondering, if you know something about science, and the natural sciences and physical sciences are one thing. When it comes to the social sciences, it's pretty common knowledge that there's a replication crisis, and science and social sciences is quite different. When it comes to what I think the science most people care about, it comes to science that informs policy decisions. So one of the things you continue to repeat throughout is the boundaries of the answers that science
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
can give to people. So in a public engagement forum, what do you describe the boundaries to be?
Okay. It really is more of a challenge to have to first summarize a question and then try your best to answer it. No, not at all. Just making excuses is all I'm doing here. Okay, so the question is, so I'm in this context of the Center for Public Engagement with Science, as I've said. So we're thinking really actively about this sort of thing. One context where it matters is the use of science to inform policy. And you rightly pointed out that one of the things I've emphasized in this talk is we need to know when to trust scientists and about what. And one implication of that is that scientists don't have all the answers. It's a particular set of answers that come from science. So the question is, what I see in my particular context and with my background as being the sort of proper scope for scientific claims, right? Or what we should trust scientists about. So I guess I get in talking myself through the question, I better understand why there's a connection to science and policy here, because it's not as if you can read public policy off the science directly, even as a lot of folks are interested in our best scientific knowledge from a range of fields informing what our policies look like. I don't know. The only thing I can say is there are no easy answers here, right? So, on the one hand, there's not a sharp divide here, where there's the game of just generating scientific knowledge, and that's done over here, and then somebody else walks over and grabs it and plugs it in over here, right? So one of the things that I do focus on a lot in my philosophy research is the ways in which the very questions asked in science are occasioned by highly specific interests that are going to in some ways shape the kinds of answers we get because they shape in such fine-grained ways what questions are being asked. So there's a way in which the identities of scientists are in very legitimate, inescapable ways shaping the sort of scientific knowledge that is being generated. So that's kind of not a clear divide. And then there can be, at least especially for certain kinds of science, a continuity between doing the science itself and plugging it in for policy implications, as I said. So I don't know that I can give a general answer. I think what we can do is look at a particular claim that's being made and what relationship that claim bears to scientific research of some particular variety, and say the extent to which the claim follows directly from the research or is an extension from that, right? And identify the ways in which it's been extended. So I think that this is something we can do contextually, but I don't know how to answer the question in the abstract very well. And I probably should be able to. Back here. Yes.
I just wanted to say in response to that, I have a good friend / colleague who was a biopsychologist who used to always say when students would complain in her classes, sorry, science seems to have a lean to the left. There's nothing I can do about that.
Interesting. Okay, so this is a point that an acquaintance has sort of apologized for science sort of being inherently, I guess, politically left-leaning, something like that. This is an opportunity that I'll say something else about, which is so much of what might seem the inherent political leaning of science, I think, relates to what it is that we want to emphasize about science, and what kind of science we emphasize. So here's what I think, at least for me, works as a quick shift in political polarization. What about ag science, right? Are you like, oh, those lefties, who knows what the farmers who go to the ag department are getting sort of brainwashed into there. Anyway, that's a really kind of quick, simple attempt, but it seems like there are ways to focus our attention on what science is doing, and type of science and how it plugs into society that I think can shift that valence pretty quickly. I'll stop there. Yes, John.
All right. So this event is Science on Tap, and it was revealed right at the very beginning that they didn't know that University of Cincinnati is a philosophy of science department, maybe one of the most well-known, at least regionally. What can philosophers of science do to correct that? Right? Because I feel like that I didn't necessarily know that. I came here for a philosophy of cognitive science from a particular sort of very single stream. I came to discover, wow, there's all kinds of philosophy of science here when I was there. But what can we do to be better about that?
Okay, so the question is, what can philosophers of science do to make it more apparent to a broader range of folks inside the university and outside the university that we exist and we can do good work? And I love this question because I think it's super important and a responsibility that our field has mostly left unmet until recent years. What we can do is talk to people other than ourselves, right? So when I went to grad school, I'm quickly getting old. I'm at that stage where I'm like, when I went to grad school 3 years ago, and I'm like, when I went to grad school, I started 20 years ago. It was palpably in the air that to do any legitimate work as a philosopher, you had to be talking to other philosophers, because if you were saying something to someone else, you must be dumbing it down. That was it, and that was what was rewarded in our field. In that 20 years, our field norms have shifted dramatically, such that a lot of folks are doing really interesting work with a broad range of collaborators and audiences, from just talking to scientists and collaborating with scientists, to engaging with folks in the community, getting involved in policy issues, things like that. So we need to do more of that. We need to start seeing our job as philosophers to be part of a broader conversation versus sitting in the corner thinking we're having a conversation that nobody else is actually interested in, I think. Yes?
So
about like polling and maybe the science of polling and how that poll was incorrect, and you touched on a little bit like priming the pollee. So there's a lot of problems with polling, but is there actually a solution or something better to get a measure for, or do we even need it?
Yeah, good. So this isn't all that the national. Oh, sorry. The question is, I mentioned all of these difficulties at the beginning with the National Science Foundation study of scientific knowledge, and is there a good way to survey people? I assume you mean specifically about scientific literacy and related issues. Yes, and I think that there is a lot of good work in that area. This is also something this is a hard thing about talking broadly to a broad audience, is you have to talk about lots of topics that you're not actually a big expert on. So I'm doing my best, but I keep reactively saying, well, I'm not an expert on that. So I'm not an expert on this, but the NSF does have a variety of other types of surveys that they use that target things like attitudes towards science as well. And there have been shifts in what the survey instruments look like since these problems have been pointed out. So I mentioned also that the NSF has very principled reasons for keeping this alive so that we can track how views change over time. But this stuff is very actively studied and worked on. And one of the researchers who is most prominent in having pointed out the Big Bang evolution issue with the survey has been working on developing an improved instrument based on this scale that seems to have been it's been tested, and it does quite well. So there are lots of resources in this area.
Yeah, so I know you talked about at the beginning some of the scientists distrust in sort of philosophy or humanities in some ways. But it seems important, especially depending on social sciences or working with marginalized groups and trying with participatory research. How do you then also show some of the ways that either whether it's teaching people about science or doing some of the research, especially if it's human-facing research, that some of this stuff like the humanities or other things, or even sometimes soft sciences compared to hard sciences, depending on how somebody defines that, like physics, or that are more based on that, of how some of those things, sorry I'm rambling, sort of how also to make sure that scientists are understanding this stuff as well as part of the scientific method.
Okay, great. So I think I just need to ask for clarification. So the bit I got is, or what I understood from what you said is, so I picked on these physicists at the beginning who are on record saying that philosophy of science is worthless. But is there a broader recognition in science that the humanities and other fields are very relevant, especially as you do things like research with public participation?
Yeah, I mean, I think even sometimes within groups that I work with, which is the disability community, a lot of the research is done about people without actually inclusion of people with disabilities, which brings flawed understanding in some ways because you're coming in from a mindset that's maybe different than, or in the medical model, sort of, and so how can we also within those, I mean, I know there's a big thing of like, within, when you're a researcher, you are supposed to be unbiased and you're supposed to not talk about your identities within that, but in some ways in these things, it also informs the way the studies are done.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So two quick. No, not at all. Thanks for the question. So two quick points in response that I think plug in with your interests here. One is, I think public participation in scientific research is fascinating and really important, and there are really interesting different research traditions of how to involve public in research across disciplines. And one huge value of interdisciplinary discussion about this is that researchers from different scientific disciplines can learn how it's done in a different kind of science, and hopefully to the end of applying that in their science. And this seems important to me for my concerns, because part of the project, I haven't really talked about this much tonight, but part of the project I think just has to be making science more trustworthy. Mm-hmm. It's great. It's a great thing. It's the best thing we have, but it's not perfect, and it's biased and limited in a lot of ways still. And so all of the tools that we can cultivate across sciences to make it more worthy of public trust, the better. I think I wove together both of my responses, so I think that's my response. Thank you. Yes, please.
So you're talking about being trustworthy. What about accessibility? Because I find a big issue is that everything's behind a paywall. Unless you're in the academic field, you can't access that research without paying. There was some news recently in the White House that they changed the rules for government-funded research, where in a couple of years it won't be allowed to be behind a paywall, but the general public can have access to it.
So what about open science?
Yeah, I mean, how big of an issue do you think that is? That
Okay.
The general public doesn't have access. They have to
Yeah.
trust the Google and the news outlets for this fantastical, headlines and stuff. So.
Yeah, so the question is about accessibility of science, and in particular, scientific research, since it's published largely in for-profit journals that are with articles behind a paywall, and so it's not readily accessible if you are not in an academic setting. I mean, I think that's a tremendous issue. Yes, I don't think all of the issues are solved by eliminating the paywalls, but I think that's really important. So that's not to minimize the importance of that step. Here's another one that I've just been thinking about recently. So as a philosopher of science who is not a scientist, I regularly need to come up with examples for my philosophical work by figuring out like the considered scientific view on something. Like a recent one for me has been chromatin pigmentation in birds, like the scarlet ibis, right? And so it doesn't matter the context, but I want to know like what we know about this. It's really hard to get that level, forget even if I have institutional affiliation, I can get to the original research. It's really hard to get that level of general consensus view based on science. I don't know where we turn if it's not Wikipedia. That strikes me as an enormous gap. We have a very broad public and scientists, practicing scientists who work on different things, who might, in a variety of circumstances, benefit from knowing the consensus view on X. And unless that's something like vaccine safety or climate change, there aren't really good places to turn for that. So I think paywalls is a huge issue. And also I think we, quite broadly, people who care about science, could really benefit from thinking more about what actually would be worth providing the general public about established scientific knowledge. It seems like a huge gap.
So do you have thoughts on the open science movement?
No. I will in like a week or two. I'm working on a book that I need to for, but I haven't thought enough about it, I'm sorry, to have anything smart to say. Yes.
So, Angela, for everyone here in the group who obviously are interested in science, do you have some takeaways that we could use to help better communicate science or talk about, the key things that we talk to other people about?
Yeah, so two quick ideas. Three quick ideas that relate to what I've said. First of all, I think it's by and large, like many things, relationship-based, right? So if it's somebody random you just met on the bus, unless they're already interested, you're probably not going to get anywhere. But if it's a cousin, right, family member, friend, you might. Second idea is I think it's most successful if it is contextual in the way that I was emphasizing for scientific literacy, right? If it's about some particular matter of concern for you or for the person you're talking with, so that it's doesn't turn into this big picture, sort of a showdown about whose broad views about the world are right, but some highly specific question, right? So it doesn't have to be about the overall safety of vaccinations if what's at issue is, should I actually get a COVID vaccine or vaccination, right? So keeping it down to specific issues, and engaging in this contextual way with people that you've established deep relationships with, ideally, And then in a way, I think that recognizes that what's at stake is almost never straightforward. I think fact X and you think fact Y, and those are in opposition, right? It's that our starting points are different, our biggest concerns are different, and what's at stake for each of us in some exchange like this varies. And so sort of appreciating that fact and trying to understand the nuances of the other person's position with regards to the whole constellation of facts and feelings that are involved, and working from there, I think is useful. Do I have time for a little story? Okay, there's a story that I love, which is about my dissertation advisor, who works in theory of evolution and is pretty prominent as like an evolution popularizer guy, at least pretty prominent as far as philosophers go. And so I heard him give a talk when I was in grad school, and he's at University of Wisconsin. It was to a packed audience, 300 people, and he got up to the group and explained clearly how intelligent design, right, or a God-centered view of I'm trying not to say evolution because it's not evolution, of a God-centered view of creation isn't scientific. And everyone, everyone who was there disagreed with us and shook their fists and asked pointed questions. And I was like, oh, this is great, right? Really, we're really engaging about this. And a few years later, in my first job at Oklahoma State University, he came to give a talk there, equally huge audience. And instead of the talk being about why intelligent design isn't a scientific theory, why you're not doing science, his point was how evolutionary theory and science can't tell you there's not a God. From my perspective, it's kind of the same thing, right? There's this separation between where the science is and where the theistic belief is. But equally big audience, and everyone's like taking notes and like, yes, okay. And it felt like the reaction was more, okay, science guy, you're telling me where there's room for my worldview here. And you're like indicating the limitations of science. And so what read to me as like kind of similar points worked entirely differently just with what the setup was like in a way that I think in the second exchange I feel like was respectful of people's concerns and identities in a way that the first just kind of was insensitive to, if that makes sense. I love that example. So
that's kind of related to a question I had, which is people's expectations of science. And I think there are a lot of people, science is this big word, it's this big powerful word, and a lot of people want certainties from it. They want absolutes from it. And there's a lot of people who think in terms of absolutes. And when you talk about religion, that can be one of those areas where, and if they discovered that in science there's differences of opinion and science changes its mind sometimes about something, well, that suddenly makes science seem untrustworthy, and do you have systems, whatever, do you have policies for addressing the difference in mentalities? I'm not asking it well, but you know what I'm
Yeah, so the question is about sort of, there can be a sense of wanting to seek certainty, and in science, in some ways, nothing's ever certain, right? People love to say about science that any established theory can be questioned in the future, right? So in some sense, part of the whole structure of the institution of science is to not take anything as 100% certain and beyond reproach ever. And so how do you deal with a conflict between those views? So first of all, I think it's worth me acknowledging that there has been a cynical misuse of this feature of science to cast doubt on anything that we might consider to be scientific knowledge, right? Oh, it's just a theory, right? Is one version that you get of that. So I think this gets back to how it's incredibly valuable to have a sense for what scientific consensus looks like, how science looks when it hasn't yet reached consensus, right? And that's a natural part of this process. And so now I'm thinking about the sort of rapid evolution of COVID-19 modeling early in the pandemic, and how all of a sudden this is sort of pretty standard and quick in this case, development of scientific research, but all of a sudden it was in public view and we were all reading articles about it in a way that we're usually not, that fascinated by. And so if you're not familiar to that process unfolding, it can make the whole game look suspect because there's not yet a consensus. All right, sorry, I'm rambling. So I think that an appreciation for what scientific consensus looks like and how to identify where there is a scientific consensus and what science looks like when there's not yet a consensus is really important. In particular, just one additional thought quickly, it is not a feature of scientific consensus that every single scientist who studies that topic has the same view, right? That's too high of a standard, and that too has been used to, that idea has been used to sort of cynically inculcate doubt in science. Yeah.
I think that misdoubt is rooted in the fact that people don't understand statistics. So how much of the course that you teach is geared around understanding and the benefits of understanding? Because it's not a required course in many, majors, and so it feels like the misunderstanding or not understanding how that works plays against people understanding the likelihood of something happening, right? They see something and they see a Facebook post and they go, oh, that must be true, and it's like, what's the likelihood of that happening? It's because they don't understand statistics.
Right.
So what emphasis do you put on that?
Yeah, okay, so the question is, the observation that statistical knowledge is really important, and then the question specifically about this textbook that I was showcasing, what attention do we place on statistics in that? So I agree with you entirely, it's super important, and basically I think every single person would do better with better grasp of statistical reasoning. We do address probability and statistics in this book from the perspective of trying to motivate the whole game of how you actually get statistical reasoning out of probability theory and sort of some basic groundwork to experiment and observation that we've laid. There is a little bit of attention in the book. We're actually working on a second edition now. So in the second edition, we'll have 13 chapters, and 3 of those will be about probability and statistics. There's a little bit of attention, actually, where in the first book, I think we went a little bit too far toward trying to get people inside of statistical hypothesis testing in science, and I think we're going to try to back away from that to kind of more of the view that I was pushing in this talk of what do we all need to understand kind of about what the game is of statistics in order to make sense of the science and understand where it's coming from, something like that. And also to know that medical tests can have false positives. It's something like 1% of cancer treatments are like the person never even had cancer. Something like terrible like that. Are we okay? And I'm just going to ask, because I've heard from both of you, if anybody, just because I'm not good at seeing hands, is there anyone who hasn't asked a question that would like to? Going once, going twice. Okay, please.
So, questions asked in the pursuit of science have the tendency to be biased. So, are there techniques to remove that bias from your applications?
Okay, so the question was, bias can enter into the questions that scientists ask, and is there a way to remove the bias? Yes, I think there is a way to do it, but no scientist can do it on their own. We got to have a bunch of different scientists with a bunch of different backgrounds and worldviews who are empowered to bring those backgrounds and worldviews into their work, not in sketchy ways of like fixing the results of studies, right? But in the ways of inspiring new questions, questioning assumptions that have been taken for granted, pushing a field in the direction of new research, and in vetting scientific work that others are producing. So I think that's the magic recipe. It's the institution of science, and it's not fully actualized yet, right? Science is, we do not see a representative sample of worldviews, social identities, backgrounds in science at this point. There's room to improve, and maybe even more so in empowering scientists to bring those backgrounds to their work. But I think that's the magic recipe. Yes, please.
So it seems like the answer for community outreach, the solution is dilution. We want to get it out to everyone, right? Is it possible that you have something to learn from religion with that regard?
Oh, interesting. So the question is, if we want to communicate broadly about science to a whole bunch of people and sort of get adherence to science, are there tools in how you can do that from other successful societal movements like religious institutions? I don't know. I think it depends on what we take the project to be and the specific aspects that we're looking at, what the answer will be there. I don't have an immediate answer. Something that it makes me think of is one thing challenging in thinking about public investment, buy-in in science, and the interface between science and the public is there is a way, and this might have been part of the question that you're asking, I'm not sure, but there is a way in which that can seem a little bit like an institution that's actually a really powerful, well-funded, well-supported institution, right? That all of our children are required to learn for years, right? Science is not hurting for societal support. It can look like that institution sort of trying to grab additional power, right? And there's something about when advocating scientific literacy and broad public trust in science starts to look like that, where I think it's right to sort of pause and be like, okay, let's go back to the basics. I'll go back to the point I made early in my talk. What is the why, right? Why do we care about this? What is it for? What end does it serve for individual people and community groups? And hopefully that's going to be where the answers are based. I hope that made sense in that context.
So, philosopher of science studied non-Western religion and literature. What about, and you talk a little bit about spreading science literacy through relationships. What about spreading science literacy through communities? That's something undeniably that churches have and that many religious institutions have, whether they have scientific views or critical scientific views, right? And they have ability to bring people together, to come to, bring differences to a head and try and resolve those because they value everybody coming to a consensus about something, whether it be moral or it be social.
Yeah, so the question is, what about building scientific literacy in a community-based way? And I think absolutely that is part of it. And part of that project's going to be disrupting any sort of societal perceptions of societal limitations to the relevance and accessibility of science that exists, and then also maybe especially this sort of magic recipe we were talking about a minute ago with public participation in scientific research as a good opportunity to produce science that is more valuable to particular communities, right? Making the science better, as well as in the process of doing that well, creating a bunch more people who are insiders to science in a very specific way and have some concrete reason actually to trust at least some kinds of science. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Angela. I have a couple quick announcements. I was going to make one comment we were talking about polling and the National Science Foundation, and I might be a little off base on this, but my general understanding of looking at the polling, and they didn't get into red, blue, or right and left or whatever, but I do think there were like age breakdowns and things of that sort. Sadly, my takeaway was that across the board, Americans are pretty damn stupid. I hate to say it, but the questions on that survey, if you go, you can look for it, you can Google it, and take the quiz yourself. I think it's everything that a sixth grader should know and should pass with flying colors, and unfortunately Americans don't. But on a different note, upcoming events. Next month, October 5th, right here, Wednesday, Urban Artifact, we have another historical archaeology presentation, this time from Cecilia Cozy, who's from UC's Classic Department, and her topic is going to be Democracy Through the Eyes of a Woman, Aspasia in Ancient Athens. Aspasia is actually a real historical figure, and going to talk about her life and her interactions in ancient Athens. And an added little bonus to that is that there will actually be music included provided by the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra. So I think that's going to be a really interesting and fun topic. Addition to that, we have a special field trip that's going to happen on Saturday, October the 8th. We have the opportunity to go and take a private tour of Fortified Hill. Fortified Hill is a very important Hopewell Indian property that has recently been reclaimed. It was up for auction. It was going to be turned into a real estate development. And at the 11th hour, the people from Pyramid Hill won the winning bid. That Fortified Hill property is adjacent to Pyramid Hill Sculpture Park up in Hamilton, if you've ever been up there. So Bob Demheimer, who has been here before just a couple months ago, who's the curator of archaeology at the Cincinnati Museum Center, has been working on reclaiming that archaeological site, and he is going to lead a tour of that. If you're interested in that, it is limited numbers of people that can go. You'll see it posted here soon at Community of Reason via Meetup, because you're going to have to RSVP for it. It is free for the tour. But this is an outstanding archaeological site, and Fortified Hill is going to be conjoined with Fort Ancient for the submission to the powers that be to be a World Heritage Site. So it's a really good thing. So anyway, thank you all for coming this evening. Hope you found the presentation as interesting and enlightening as I did. Have a safe evening going home, and hope to see you next month, next October the 5th. Thanks again.
With all that is required, just to make it through the day. I have set my heart on fire for that soothing